Today we're looking at a favorite story of mine that beautifully illustrates the benefits of redaction criticism. Redaction criticism looks at the writers and their audiences to see how those things were influencing what was written and how it was written. The style, the construction, the vocabulary choice, the use of jargon, commentary inserted by the writer, cultural clues, all those things that sort of flesh out the writing and help us to feel more connected to the person doing the writing and what their original intent may or may not have been. So the story in question is Jesus cleansing the leper. It's found in Matthew chapter 8 as well as Luke chapter 5. And it's the same story, but it has subtle differences, and those differences are revealing. Let's dive right in and take a look at Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. So notice who came to Jesus. Matthew tells us a leper came to Jesus, a person who is defined by his disease. It's so much so that he doesn't even say a guy afflicted with leprosy. A leper came. He is defined by that disease. So Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels, with clearly based on the structure and the vocabulary choice throughout his Gospel. The content, the focus is a Jewish audience, and he reveals to us with his choice of words here, his orientation, his mindset toward the disease of leprosy. A leper came to Jesus. So leprosy is a predominant illness in the first century in that part of the world. And it's an umbrella term to deal with diseases of the skin. But it's not just a disease, it's also a ceremonial problem. What do I mean by that? If you're a leper, you are marked as unclean and you can't participate in the festivals and rites and rituals of your religion. You can't go to the temple. You can't go to Passover. You can't go to synagogue and be with your fellow religionists. You're an outcast. You're unclean. You're feared to be contagious. Although today we understand that many skin diseases aren't contagious at all. They're an autoimmune issue, etc. But if you are unclean, if you were a leper, if you had a skin disease, you were unclean both religiously and socially and couldn't be a part of the community life or the religious community. So we see that he becomes an invisible part of the community until he does the unthinkable and shows up in the middle of this crowd to approach Jesus. And behold, a leper came. Let's move on to Luke chapter 5, and here's verse 12 from the ESV. While he was in one of the cities, there came a man full of leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Does that sound familiar? It should sound familiar. The plea from the person with leprosy to Jesus is identical. It's verbatim in Matthew 8 and in Luke 5. If you read it in Koine, it is word for word the exact same plea in both Gospels from the person with leprosy to Jesus. Let's look at the differences. The setting is different. In Matthew, Jesus is coming down the mountain after the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, this happens just before the Sermon on the Mount, and it happens in one of the cities. He doesn't even tell us which one. It's not important which one, apparently, to him. A subtle difference is Matthew has the leper come and kneel before Jesus, and Luke has him fall on his face before Jesus and beseech him with this plea. But let's look at what I think is the most important difference between the two. and we'll see them together on the screen at the same time. Matthew says, kai idou lepros, and behold, a leper, while Luke says, kai idou aner pleres lepros, and behold, a man aner pleres lepros, full of leprosy. So Matthew says a leper came, but Luke says a man full of leprosy came. What's the difference? Why am I splitting hairs on this description? Because Luke, the Gentile physician, writing to Theophilus, his Gentile audience, doesn't have a religious bias about leprosy. He sees it as a common skin disease that he's treated and has encountered throughout his life. Matthew describes a leper. In other words, the disease and the man are one and the same. But Luke describes a man full of leprosy, a man with leprosy. Even if he's ate up with leprosy, even if he's head to toe covered in the signs of leprosy, Luke's description is a man came. What kind of man? A man full of leprosy. So the man and the disease are not one and the same for Luke. A man came full of leprosy. Let's carry on and look at what comes next in both tellings. Matthew 8:3, and Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will, or I wish, I desire, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Now we go to Luke 5:13. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. Again, the first part of both verbs, verbatim, identical. But look at this difference at the end. And immediately the leprosy left him. Did you see the difference? His leprosy was cleansed versus the leprosy left him. Let's take a look at it in Koine. So Matthew says, ekathariste autou he lepra. So he lepra, the leprosy, autou, of him, his leprosy, ekathariste, was cleansed. So immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Not generic leprosy, the leprosy intrinsic to the leper who showed up to ask Jesus for this cleansing. Now let's look at Luke. He lepra apelthen ap autou. So he lepra, just like Matthew, the leprosy, but not his leprosy, the leprosy, apelthen departed ap autou, from him. The leprosy departed from him. So for Matthew, his leprosy is intrinsic. His leprosy is a part of him, and it was cleansed. And as a result, he is cleansed. So he's no longer unclean. He's no longer a leper. He's now a man who used to be a leper. But for Luke, the leprosy departed from him, says the leprosy was an extrinsic thing. It was something that was alien to him that came into his life for a while. Now Jesus cleansed him, touched him, reached out and touched him, said, I do desire it, be clean. And that thing that intruded on his life now has departed from him and is gone. The unwelcome alien has left him. So you see the difference in emphasis, right? It's hard to miss. The exact same man with the exact same condition comes to Jesus, asks for the exact same boon. Lord, if you desire it, you are able to make me clean. It's the exact same ask by the same guy. He receives the same touch. He stretched out his hand and touched him. He receives the same cleansing, the same restoration to life, and is told to do the same thing. If you read the rest of both stories, Jesus says, go to the priest, show yourself to him, make the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them, so they'll know that this thing, that you acknowledge that God has made this possible for you. So if there's so many things that are the same, But we look at those subtle differences, the mountain versus the city, a leper versus a man full of leprosy. Why not assume that these are two different lepers and this is the telling of two different stories? The reason that I think it's safe for you to view it as not being two different lepers and two different stories is both the leper's words and Jesus' words are quoted to be identical. So when Matthew tells the story, the leper says the words exactly the same as he says in Luke's telling of the story. When Jesus replies, both Matthew and Luke have the reply identical to each other. It's verbatim quotes. They're saying the exact same words. When Jesus stretches out his hand and touches the man, it's verbatim. It's identical. So, and then he also tells them to go do the same thing, right? So why does that matter? Because in the facts of the story, in the bones of what transpired between this man and Jesus, there's no dispute. The only differences are from the viewpoint of the narrators. So Matthew is narrating the story in his gospel. Luke is narrating the story in his gospel. And the differences are from the viewpoint of the narrator, not from what happened. Right? So we can conclude from that this is almost surely the same story, with the only differences being in the perspective of the narrator. That's what makes redaction criticism interesting, because we're taking into account the experience, the understanding, and the perspective of the narrator to help us understand why Luke speaks of a leper and, why Matthew speaks of a leper and Luke speaks of a man full of leprosy. One, with his Jewish background and the cultic significance, sees leprosy being so completely entwined in the life of this man as to make them one and the same. But the physician, who's a Gentile, who doesn't have the same religious bias, sees a man, a patient, whose condition is he's afflicted quite severely with leprosy. See the difference in the viewpoint of the narrator. That doesn't change the story. In both cases, Lord, if you desire it, you can cleanse me. You have the power. You are able to cleanse me. Same story, same boon is asked, same effect. He stretched out his hand and touched him, and immediately he was cleansed. Immediately he was cleansed gives us a perspective difference though, right? Immediately his leprosy was cleansed versus immediately the leprosy departed from him. The narrator's perspective. Okay, let's get back. Those subtle differences of Jewish and Gentile for both writer and audience gives us a glimpse into the differences in the worldview that how they saw life, religion, culture, sin, sickness. Does Luke sound like he believes that the man's condition is tied to his behavior? No, but if you grew up in a system that says a guy with that kind of condition is on the outs with God and can't come to temple, that's a very different perspective, isn't it? I had a calendar on my desk for years that was business quotes. And one of them said, when two people in business together always agree, one of them is unnecessary. I love that quote. When two people in business together always agree, one of them is unnecessary. So stop and ask yourself how to approach two biblical authors telling the same story, but having it have differences in the story. Wouldn't it be better, wouldn't it be more authoritative if they both agreed verbatim throughout from beginning to end? Perhaps, but I would posit to you that if they agreed verbatim from beginning to end, one of them would be unnecessary. Why tell me the story twice if I'm reading the identical words? This the beauty of having these four Gospels, that three synoptics and John, having the synoptics tell the same basic story, including many of the same events, but with a slightly different perspective. That perspective may reach one person differently than the other perspective. A reader may be more touched by Matthew than by Luke, or vice versa. They may both be much more touched by John's gospel than any of the synoptics. The magnificence is they don't need to be exactly the same to have impact and power. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other or worse than the other. It doesn't mean that one is more authoritative than the other. It does raise the question, are two necessary? I don't know. But what I do know is I really appreciate the extra flavor, if you will, that we get from having these two different narrators with their two different takes, revealing their two different backgrounds, histories, and understandings and perspectives, so that as I come to the text, as we all come to the text, we may see something a little bit different. To me, that's the beauty and the power of redaction criticism. If that was good for you, you know all the good stuff to do, the liking and the sharing and the so forth. And until we see one another again, charis humin kai irene, grace to you and peace.